My name is Joshua Gibson, and you are listening to the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast, a show dedicated to promoting a message of critical thinking as it pertains to strength training, nutrition, and well-being. This is done through interviews with experts, high-level athletes, coaches, and people heavily involved in strength sports and athletic development. Pull up a chair, grab a coffee, and let's get on to today's podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Gibson, and I'm joined today by Ambrose Serrano. And I think the podcast has taken a slightly different shift, a slightly different bend, given we've had on more S&C professionals, thought leaders in the space. A recent podcast. If people haven't listened to it, I did a recent podcast with Meg Stone, and that was tremendous. Like listening to Meg talk about cleaning, 352 pounds and being the first female D1 head strength coach. That's awesome. So I would really recommend people check that episode out. We've had on Paul Comfort, host of great professionals, and I thought, why not continue the trend and keep the information pipeline running? And Ambrose is a seasoned S&C veteran, and I think provides great perspective on Olympic sports. So, Ambrose, thanks for joining me on the show.
Yeah, thanks for reaching out. Good to be a part of this. Hopefully we can have a good conversation about, like you said, Olympic sport. That's what I've been in for the last, Olympic sport specifically for the last almost 13 years. So hopefully I can provide a little bit more perspective in that area.
Yeah, and I think the best place always to start is what ignited the interest in athletics and sport in the first place.
Yeah, it's funny. If we go back, I don't know how far you have to go back, right? Like, I mean, I think everybody was active as a kid. You played sports, play with your friends, all that stuff. Weightlifting and weight training, I was interested in pretty early on. Me and my friends were just going to like a random friend that had like a parent that had weights in their garage or something. I think back in middle school, we were messing around and then, really got into that and enjoyed it, throughout all the way until now and all the way throughout the entirety kind of. So always interested in kind of athletics and movement and things like that. It was high school when I was like, man, I think I should probably go to college. I'm an academic kind of kid. I did well in school. So I was like, I should have gone to college. And so what I did was like, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I think that was the reality of it. Going into college, I actually didn't know what I wanted to do. But I think part of it was an ignorance on what was available to you, like not really understanding what the landscape was in the first place on what's available to you in terms of a career path, potentially in sport or weightlifting or whatever. And so, colleges send you stuff. And so I think I laid out like 5 different college programs. And I literally just started checking off majors. I'm like, all right, well, I don't know what's out there. So just gotta kind of look through and see what's going on. And I just started like, no. They might have like 50 majors on there. No. And the common theme of ones that was willing to actually circle that I might have interest in had words like athletic training. Okay, cool. Didn't really realize that was medical, but like athletic training or exercise science or exercise physiology or like something in that realm. And so that seemed to be the common theme that was kind of popping out to me. So I was like, okay, cool. I ended up going to, so I grew up in Illinois, grew up in the Midwest. I ended up going to Truman State University, which is in Missouri, Northeast Missouri. And I did kind of a college visit there. And I chose to go there because they do have a really good exercise science program, but they also allowed kind of choice within program. Once you got into the junior, senior levels, you could kind of specialize within an undergraduate manner, kind of specialize your 300, 400, 500 level classes towards something a little bit more specific. And I like that still because even though I knew I wanted to do exercise science, I still didn't really know what I wanted to do. I just know I wanted to do something in that realm. But you had, biomechanics and athletic training and pre-PT, and you could do medical, and you could do exercise physiology, and you do all these different things. So it was nice for me to still have choice for a couple more years and to determine that. It wasn't until college actually that I got into weightlifting. Had never done any cleans or snatches or anything like that in high school, coming from a small town in Illinois. I wrestled in high school, so that's kind of where my background was. And so it took me a while to kind of get into weightlifting, but that's where I got into weightlifting, realized I liked it a lot in terms of the Olympic style weightlifting. Uh, and that kind of geared, kind of my path as a coach. I started coaching. I got certified as a level one coach. Started coaching the club. Opened up more sessions for the club. We could get more people attending kind of weightlifting meets and those types of things and getting involved because we are kind of expanding that. And so that's kind of what introduced me into coaching. And so ultimately, my professor and advisor and my primary person kind of in undergrad was Dr. Alex Cook, and he had actually gotten some education under the Stones as well, and so he kind of just pushed me that way. He's like, I think you're going to want to do things that they like to do, and so he kind of introduced me to that world a little bit, the Stones and those types of things, and so that's where I went to. I got my master's degree at East Tennessee State University, um, knowing that I wanted to coach. Right, I didn't want to necessarily do research. Obviously you're really ingrained in that and thrown into it, but I knew I wanted to work with athletes. I knew I wanted to coach strength and conditioning specifically, and so it just worked really well. The involvement that you have, and I think Joshua, you went to East
Yeah.
ETSU, right? And so this, like, they throw you into it, right? Working with the athletes, working with the coaches, really having responsibility behind that and the sports science and doing performance monitoring and all that stuff. And so I think it worked out really well. It was a great choice, and I think it was a really good progression within my development. And then that's where I kind of eventually made my way up to the North Country of New York in the Adirondacks, where we have one of the Olympic and Paralympic training centers with the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee, where we primarily work with winter sport. And so that's where I got my first kind of glimpse of Olympic sport outside of the collegiate world, and and again, it was just a great progression in terms of where I was a really young coach, mid 20s, working in the professional world, and um, had a great mentor while I was here, uh, um, Dr. Brad DeWeese, uh, who at the time was working at the training center and really ignited my kind of comprehensive understanding of like more speed based stuff and sprint mechanics and plyometrics and integrating that into the philosophy of kind of the strength development and power development that I had come in with, that was a little bit stronger on in the performance monitoring side. And then we just kind of built from there. And so now it's been over a decade of building on that groundwork. But yeah, that's what pushed me in. It wasn't anything specific. It wasn't like, I got it. PT, sometimes they get injured and they had a knee surgery and they really like that process. It wasn't anything specific. It was just purely I really didn't have. That was what I was interested in. I was interested in working with athletes in sport, in the kind of the strength conditioning. I just need to say we are having thunderstorms here. I don't know if you noticed, the lights are kind of flickering a little bit, so we have thunderstorms here. But that's what's kind of going on in the background. But yeah, it's kind of I don't know if it's a unique story or not, but I really didn't know what I wanted to do, and it just kind of create an awareness of just literally just checking it off and then throwing myself into that area and then realizing that that's what I wanted to do.
Yeah,
So
and I think the one thing I want to kind of pick out, maybe touch on a little bit more, and get your perspective on as a professional strength and conditioning
yeah.
coach, and integral piece at the OTC is there are a lot of kids, because I'm a strength coach at a high school. There are
Hmm.
a lot of kids who maybe don't know what they want to do in college, and they love athletics, they love sport, they love the process of becoming better, and
Yeah.
they think exercise physiology, they think exercise science, maybe they think athletic training, but I don't know if there's that like obvious connection with like professional sports, Olympic sports, collegiate athletics. strength and conditioning, sports science, and then coming out of high school. So maybe you
Uh-huh.
can just talk
Uh-huh.
about what you wish you would have known
Uh-huh.
coming out of high school into undergrad as someone who's had a decade doing it now. The mission of Weightlifting House is to bring the sport of weightlifting closer to the coaches, fans, and athletes. They're able to do this by supporting the Philosophical Weightlifting podcast. You can use the code PHILWL, that's PHILWL, at the USA Weightlifting House store. That will save you 10% off all products, including bars, straps, wraps, singlets, and anything else you could imagine. That is PHILWL, PHILWL, to save 10% off everything at the Weightlifting House store. And by supporting the podcast, you support Weightlifting House.
Yeah, well, I think the biggest thing is like, and it becomes much more obvious the more experience you get. It seems very obvious as a statement, but it becomes much more obvious is that you don't actually have to know it all. Like you don't have to jump in and say, well, I have to do this and I have to do that and I have to get experience here. One of the beauties of being in the position that I'm in, which is very different than other coaches, they're not kind of in this position, but it's like I have a lot of professionals on my team that work in very specialized areas. And I think what was great is it allows me to focus in the areas that I really want to be good at, and so I can an expert in a specific area within a facet of the team that helps out the athlete. And so I'm really good in the strength power development and the strength conditioning. I'm good at creating comprehensive plans and thinking through a process. But I don't need to know the ins and outs of performance nutrition. I don't need to know the medical piece to it. I don't need to know how to rehab a knee injury. I don't need to know how to, work on mental training at a high level. Knowing bits and pieces of it enough to make referrals, enough to know where to send an athlete or to send an individual is very important. So we have to have like that comprehensive base knowledge, which is important. But in my field, and I think that's important for someone that's young, is like, because it can become a little bit overbearing, can be, if you're looking at it as like, man, there's like so many things involved. Once you actually dive into it, there's so many things involved in athletics and performance, and you're working directly with athletes, is that it can seem like too much, because it is too much. And I think and so a big part of my job is really trusting and understanding my expertise, what I'm good at, and then what my colleagues are good at. And so really working as a team in referring and delegating and those types of things become a huge part of my role right now. And I can better serve an athlete and in terms of what they need to get better and perform better on the playing field or the ice or whatever it may be, if I actually relinquish responsibility on the performance side to those other individuals that are actually better experts in the area. So I think it takes a while, and you have to be thrown kind of in a position. I know not everybody has kind of those capabilities, but I think, but kind of backing it up a little bit, if you don't have that team around you saying, I don't know, let's figure it out, is also an okay answer. And not having to know the answer all the time is also the most appropriate answer. A lot of times athletes themselves are really involved in it as well. And if you say, hey, I actually don't know, maybe we can figure this out. They respect that. One, they don't expect you to know everything all the time. They'd like you to. They don't really expect you to know everything all the time. But I think they respect the idea that you're not just making something up or just forcing something into the plan, that everything that's in the plan is actually something that you're confident in. You're just not making it up, or you're not just winging it. And so I think that's part of it. It's like if you back it up all the way, not everybody has a full team. Like I said, is that it's okay to say you don't know, but let me look into it so we can figure it out, like for a better situation than we have right now. So that's probably a really big one, honestly, because you don't know a lot. I mean, you don't realize that you don't know anything until you learn a little bit more, right? It was every step of the way. I thought it was the man, right? Oh, after high school, I'm the man. Oh yeah, okay, good. And go to college, you don't know anything. And it's like, oh, okay, after college, I'm good. Grad school is gonna be. Oh, I don't know anything. Once you start specializing, oh, you don't know anything. Oh, and then I get my first professional job. It's like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna be good. Oh, I don't know anything. There's so much more that I can learn. And it's like even now, it's like still learning more and more. We're still integrating more pieces into our programming now than we were last year. And so it's like there's always more. And I think sitting back and saying, I don't know, and then willing to figure it out and how it fits into your plan. I have a philosophy. If I can learn how something functions, I learn how it fits into my plan.
Mm.
It doesn't always fit in this, exactly the same way that it's out there, that it's published, but it may be great. Figure out how it fits into your plan and how it kind of complements everything else that's within the program. So I think that's a big one.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great point. And even thinking about my own coaching approach, when you do learn something new or figure out a new way of improving rate of force development or maximal strength, and you're like, oh, that's cool, let me try it out, and then you don't fit it to your plan, you fit your plan to it just kind of
Yeah,
looks like it's out of
yeah,
place. And it's
yeah,
almost
exactly
like,
right.
it's this idea of like, you can put icing on every cake, but not every icing should go on every cake. It's like you
Right.
got to figure out kind of how they play together, the interplay of one thing and another. And I think your philosophy of, well, how does this fit into my established approach that I've developed over a decade of doing this? I think that's important.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think, and this is something I tell athletes because so I work with team. So I work with the USOPC. That's who I work for. So I'm a service provider. I think as far as just a general understanding, I'm a service provided to athletes that come into the training facility. So I work with a lot of like bobsledders, for example, but I don't work with all the bobsledders on the U.S. team. And so there's a lot of coach influence that comes into these programs. And so an athlete will come in and be like, oh, what do you think about what my coach is doing with me right now? It's like, I don't know exactly what your coach is doing with you right now. I can't just take a snapshot of what your program looks like in this moment and say it's good or bad, or it needs this or it needs that. There's a whole plan behind what happens. And it's the same with my plan. You can't just look at one block of programming and say, oh, well, he doesn't do this or he doesn't do that or he doesn't do this enough or he does too much of that or you don't know. Like this is building, this is coming from something, this is going towards something. So there's going to be more pieces implemented to it. There's going to be pieces taken out of it. And so, and that's one thing that I think is important to identify with athletes and understand is like, I'm not here to criticize or talk about, what programs should or shouldn't look like. My plan, I know what my plan is going to look like and where it's going and how I'm integrating things. I don't know necessarily how a coach is doing that themselves, where they're coming from, where they're going with the program. That's a conversation that athletes need to have with their coaches, right? And so I think that is really important to know. My ability to execute my plan the way it's written is at a high level. My ability to execute your plan the way it's written is not as good as you. You understand how you wrote it, um, and so yeah, you read a research article about whatever it may be, or maybe there's a podcast, or maybe there's some sort of article on bar bend or something, and you're saying, okay, they did it this way. Why did they do it that way, and how does it fit into my structure to lift up what we're trying to get out of power output or strength development or speed or whatever it is, right? And so you take that, it's like, okay, that's how it works, but how do we filter it in? And I think that's really important concept as well.
Well, and I think on top of that idea, when you take another coach's work and you try to break it down, you assume that it's the way that it is because that's how it's always been. But
Yeah.
like I worked with Glenn Pinlay years and years and years ago, and I remember he mentioned trying pretty much everything. And it's like, oh yeah, you have to remind yourself that someone who's been coaching for 10, 15, 20 years has probably tried a lot. And it's not because it didn't necessarily work, but like for their system of doing it, it maybe didn't fit or maybe doesn't
Yeah.
fit for the current situation. So there's a lot of context baked in that you can't pull out with one snapshot.
Yeah. And more is not always better, right? We know
Right.
that. more is not always better. Sometimes removing something is better. And so just because there's something out there that's great doesn't mean that there's enough bandwidth for it. Doesn't mean there's enough recovery built into the plan to actually implement that. So sometimes you're going to bring something in. It's like, okay, is it going to replace? Is it an addition? Is it a supplement? Is it an option? Uh, so all that goes into it. There's a lot of there's a lot of good training methods out there, and trying to do all of them within an annual plan or even within a quad plan um, is a challenging puzzle to figure out if you're actually trying to execute everything that's out there. So I generally don't put something in a program unless I feel confident that I understand how I'm going to do it. Even though I may know that it's good to go, if I don't completely understand it to a certain level, or the people I'm working with can't help me execute it at a certain level, then I'm not going to put it in. And those are conversations I have with athletes sometimes. Why don't we do this or that or that? And it's like, no, that would be great. That's a great option. We just got to figure out how to best do it.
Yeah, and I'd be curious now to dig in a little bit more to your time with the USOPC, what
Yeah.
that was like going from going from your master's degree to working as a professional, and then what that learning process was like, along with day-to-day responsibilities and what your work entails.
Yeah. Like I said, you got to kind of go back to, well, I thought I knew a lot and then realized I didn't know a lot, or at least enough to be in the situation I was in. That's where you have to throw yourself in a position. They say you don't want to be the smartest person in the room, right? Well, especially when you're young, I was 25 years old coming out of grad school. You don't want to be the smartest person in the room. You want to have good mentors. You want to be in a good place to like be an apprentice and learn from. And fortunately, I was in that position. Even though I had phenomenal education and mentors out of East Tennessee State University, I was thrown in a position that was great for my development in someone that could complement that in Brad Deweese, and so that was great. I felt like in that aspect of training, I knew nothing for 2 years, and then Brad left. Actually, went to East Tennessee State, ironically enough, and was a professor there. And when he left, and I continued to take on more responsibility in this environment, I still felt like, man, I'm not ready for Brad to leave. Like, I'm still trying to figure out how all of this extra stuff fits into my program. But again, that was still good because now it puts more pressure on me. I can't rely on someone else, or I can't ask as many questions. Now I have to actually execute at a higher level, and that was probably still a good progression. And so, like I said, this is year, I don't know, I think in August it's 13 years living here in the Adirondacks, and this year we're doing something a little bit different than we did last year, than we did year before, and we have different professionals, and I think that's the thing we talked about, utilizing your team and the expertise. Well, bringing in an intern or bringing in a fellow out of grad school, they even have it maybe a slightly different expertise than myself, even though I'm 13 years into this role. My fellow may actually be a little bit more primed to do something and execute something than I am, because their experience and the mentors that they had gave them that opportunity. And so that actually, I take advantage of that, and I try to understand what are the strengths and weaknesses of everybody that I have with me. And if I'm trying to implement something new, that if my current fellow has more experience than I do in that area, I might give them a little bit more responsibility in figuring out how to execute that within the plan. And so, I think that's the thing, is like, I try to bring in people that really complement what we're doing here, but also bring something to the table. That's a big thing. Is like the education piece. Obviously, we're bringing in a fellow. Maybe it's a year-long fellowship or a two-year-long fellowship, and that's been a big part of my development as a coach as well. In my learning, is that it's twofold. I want to give them a really good learning environment, and hopefully they are, with everything that I can give them, and giving them more responsibility and experience in this area. But I also want to pull from them as much as I can so that they leave something
Mm,
here when they depart.
yeah.
And that's been really important over the years, is trying to figure out what can this individual actually bring that complements and builds upon what we're doing here, and the athletes can really appreciate that too. Um, and then the next fellow that comes, they have more opportunity to learn even more, because now we're even more suited to do even more within a program, or ask more questions, um, or really fine tune. Yeah, I like this a little bit better, or I like this here instead of here, or whatever is in the plan.
Yeah,
So
and you
big one
mentioned
throughout the years
yeah,
is
and you mentioned being a like a service that athletes can use in working with some of the bobsledders, but not all of them. What is the structure? So for your
yeah,
professional job at the USOPC and at the OTC, um, what do you do? Like what does the structure of
yeah.
it look like? What are the roles? Fill us in, because I'm sure many people don't have any insight or a glimpse into what being a strength and conditioning professional at the OTC would be like.
Yeah. Well, it's yeah. So you're exactly right. I think there's some like miscommunication, or just some general misunderstanding in terms of what happens on Olympic level. So I work for the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee, and I am designated under what we deem Team One, which is winter sport. I'm hub based, so I'm like Lake Placid Olympic Paralympic Training Center based. I do travel with some of the teams. I do go to some big events and things like that. But I'm really kind of a managing and lead kind of strength conditioning coach within the facility. What that means, being a winter sports service provider, is that I work with all winter sports that may need or want to take advantage of my services, or the training center services. So for each sport, how much I work with them, the amount of athletes I work with, and the degree in which I'm actually writing out programming, and how comprehensive that plan is very different depending on the sport. Every sport's needs are a little bit different. Every coach may ask for something a little bit different. The infrastructure of every sport's a little bit different. Some sports have their own, like U.S. Ski and Snowboard has their own training center of excellence in Park City, Utah. They have their own strength conditioning staff, sport physiology staff, sports med staff, name it. They have it. They have their own facilities, everything. They don't need my support as a winter sport strength conditioning coach and service provider nearly as much as maybe like USA Luge, who's based in Lake Placid, who utilizes the training center more. Their whole national team is here. They utilize their support more than US Ski and Snowboard does, for example. And so my level of programming is much more comprehensive for them, and they're here, than it is for US ski and snowboard. Part of that is due to just the nature of the sport. Luge, bobsled, and skeleton are primary here because we have a sliding track. There's
Hmm.
only two sliding tracks in the country. One's in Park City, Utah, and one's in Lake Placid, New York. And so some of it is just because the resources that we have in Lake Placid are one of two spots in the entire country that actually take advantage of those resources. And so that's a little bit, just kind of happens like that. But so I think that's really important to understand, is like every sport is kind of different in terms of how I provide. Some of them I just open the door, turn on the lights, and make sure they have what they need as far as equipment. And then some of them I'm doing everything, right? Writing every exercise modality, every Monday through Saturday, and recovery, and implementing and coaching it on the floor, and spending a lot of time with them, sometimes traveling with them as well. And so there's a big span in terms of what my responsibilities are. A second part of my role then is just being kind of that communication piece between winter sport national governing bodies and the USOPC. And so as far as like strength conditioning or sport performance goes, I'm a big point of contact for all the winter sport NGBs to make sure that they're getting what they need. We may have, we'll do like educational talks with the winter sports strength conditioning coaches, and we talk about different topics.
Mm.
We plan, going into the Olympic Games, which will be next year, not this coming February, but in a year and a half, we have the Olympic Games going to Italy. And so the planning process behind that and making sure that every sport gets what they need as far as the strength conditioning services, what do the villages look like, and kind of planning that to make sure that their athletes are getting what they need. That all starts, yesterday. And so, I'm a big part of that planning process for the winter team as well, being part of the USOPC and not just kind of a representative for a sport. And so it's a little bit more involved in that case, but I have to be kind of flexible and adaptable and available for the sports based on their needs and how I can help them.
Hey, what's up, weightlifters? Danny here, founder of Onyx Weightlifting Co., a leather accessories company specializing in weightlifting gear. In our shop, we make gear that doesn't get in the way of your performance because we understand that hitting lifts requires your full attention. Our straps, wrist wraps, and belts are designed to be comfortable and reliable, so all you need to do is make lifts. Thanks for listening to our friend Josh's podcast. You can continue to support him by visiting our online shop at onyxstraps.com and using his code PHILWL. That's PHILWL at checkout. See you on the platform.
Yeah, and considering that you would manage, I don't know how many athletes or how much time you spend on the floor, but there are athletes of many different sports. What's that like trying to manage, writing plans and training programs for athletes of kind of a wide variety of backgrounds?
It is interesting. I think obviously the more that we know each other, the better it can be done. I was talking, we had a rookie camp. I think they're still in, maybe leaving tomorrow. Rookie bobsled camp was in. And so one of the coaches is giving a tour. They're not like training or anything. They're just learning bobsled. How does it work? Let's push on the dry land track, maybe in the ice house, figure out how this sport works. And so they're giving me a tour. And so he's like, hey, can you speak with these guys for a little bit? Our luge team was training at the time, just talking through it. And I think the big thing is that obviously we want to know where they're coming from. Okay, so you're a collegiate football player, and this is where you're coming from. This is where your strengths are, but you never really worked sprint mechanics. You never really worked Olympic weightlifting, derivatives and like technique there. And then others come in with phenomenal technique, right? Maybe they came out of track and field, so their sprinting is great, but their weightlifting is not so much. Or maybe, we have a swimmer. He was a big time swimmer in California, is on the bobsled team. Believe it or not, his weightlifting is actually really, really good. He has great technique just because he happens to work with a coach that did that. And so you would think a swimmer would need a little bit more. Now, he's not a great sprinter. That's believable. But you would think a swimmer maybe not so great in the dry land, but he's great on dry land in terms of the weight room goes. On the sprinting side, needs some work. And so you just kind of have to learn each athlete in terms of how much you have to dive into the technique. But outside of that, the programming is obviously not that hard in terms of I'm concerned for athletes, because I kind of break it down in three different areas. I do the athletic development, which is the same for every athlete, in my opinion. We're working squat-based movements. We're working Olympic derivatives. We're doing posterior chain. We're doing so all of that, and how we progress that, and how you progress the Olympic derivatives throughout your training phases. That's pretty standard, in my opinion. Some may need a little bit more technical support. Maybe we stay a little bit longer in a certain area, but that's pretty standard. And I don't really care what sport you're doing, because that's how we develop you as an athlete. And I'm not a sport coach. I'm not here to teach you how to do your sport. I wouldn't do a very good job if that was my role. And so my biggest thing is I want to prepare these athletes to be the most capable they can be when they do their sport. And And so a big portion of that is that just let's have you be a very capable, strong, powerful athlete. And so that first portion of the training is really pretty standard across the board. That second portion of training, so the next couple exercises are what I deem just the sport relevant exercises. Again, we're not talking specific things. So like for a luge athlete who does use their upper body more, has to use their shoulder joint a lot more in terms of when they're paddling on the ice and those types of things. Yeah, we have to worry about shoulder health. Yeah, we have to worry about general pulling strength. We have to worry about more upper body strength and capacity in general. So like pull-ups, prone rows, those are sport relevant movements that I may focus on a little bit more with a luge athlete that is very much an upper body important athlete versus a bobsledder where I filter in more step ups and walking lunges and like things like that are like unilateral lower body movements that are sport relevant. Again, not sport specific, right? It doesn't look exactly like pushing a bobsled or sprinting, but it's very much sport relevant relative to like a luge athlete that we won't do as much unilateral lower body movements as we would like a bobsled or skeleton athlete. And so that's kind of that sport relevant section. And then if we have time and capacity to do it, which we do here a lot, athletes are really kind of full-time training. And that's, the beauty of being at the training center is that if they need to be in the weight room for 3 hours because it's a heavy work capacity block, then they need to be in the weight room for 3 hours and they just kind of do it. But that last section we have kind of, I'm talking more like kind of specifically in the weight room, is that sport specific where I have much more conversation with the athletes themselves. They guide me a little bit and they say, what do you think you kind of need a little bit more? What seems to be a little bit more specific in terms of the sensations you feel when you're paddling? What does it feel like when you're pushing a bobsled? What do you think and really trying to learn the sport, because I haven't done these sports myself. And if I've experienced them, they were not at a high level and not to a point where I really understand them. So that last section, I really take a lot of input from the athletes and the coaches to say, okay, what would you consider sport specific without actually doing your sport? Getting a little bit deeper than just the sport relevancy. And so that's kind of how I break down like my weight room sessions. And then each one, as you probably would guess, coming out of East Tennessee, it's phase potentiation, block periodization. And so I want to make sure that everything within that plan, it doesn't matter if it's the basic athletic development, it doesn't matter if it's the sport relevant movements or the sport specific movements, it still needs to be complementing the focus of that phase, of that block. And then that's how I kind of treat, when I create my annual plan and we kind of figure that out, that's how I figure it out. It's like, how do I progress these movements over the next several months as we go into the season?
And so how do you conceptualize, and you mentioned, which is, it's always great to hear, there's just good strength and conditioning training, which is, good athletic training, which is heavier compounds, higher velocity movements, Olympic, like weightlifting derivatives. So that's always great to hear. How do you organize or structure your training so that, say, for someone who is a luge athlete or a bobsled athlete, you can tell how that weight room work is carrying over or affecting their performance on the ice?
Yeah, that's not always the easiest thing to tell, right? I mean, there's multiple ways that we kind of try to attack it here. One is just the general, again, if we back it up and say, okay, we need to make sure that you're an athlete and you're like ready to be a really good luge athlete, then there are certain things that we still do in testing. Like we still do mid-thigh pulls. How is your rate of force development looking throughout these? How are you adapting to this phase? Is your rate of force plummet because we're just doing high volume and heavy squats? Are we seeing a rebound because we're starting to do more power and speed? And that gives me an idea that we're actually responding to a training phase physically, neurologically, in a way that I'd want them to as we get them to the sport. Again, It's like, I'm making them a better luge athlete, but I'm not teaching them luge.
Yeah.
I'm making them more capable to do luge. And so we need to see the right responses from the training so that they're prepared to do their sport at the best that they can. So like mid thigh pulls, and doing maybe even for a luge athlete, maybe we're doing like a jump or something like that every so often to see how they're responding neurologically and just generally physically and fatigue and those types of things. We do that. Another thing that I do, and I think this it is obviously very important, is that we have the benefit of having an ice house in Lake Placid. And so as soon as they start paddling on ice and practicing that part of their sport, we can start seeing fatigue measures. We can start seeing readiness measures that is much more sport specific. And we start getting like much more feedback from the athlete themselves. Oh, I feel a little sluggish. Oh, my forearm was a little tight today, or I don't feel poppy, or I felt really poppy today. And I'm just like, okay, that makes sense, or it doesn't make sense based on what we just did this past week, or what we've been doing the last couple of months, or whatever. And we can kind of gauge that and have that conversation, and then we can see the trends of the team. Is that normal for the team? Is the team responding like that throughout the when they're doing kind of their paddle training on ice, or is it individuals? And so that's an important part to it too. And so every time they come to me, it's like, oh, how was training today? How were your paddles today? What were your speeds today? What were your times today? What was that? And then it's not to say that was good or bad. It's just to say, okay, well, that's how you're responding right now to what you just did 2 days ago, or 2 weeks ago, or last month, right? We might still have residual fatigue, or we're moving into that. We expect to see a little bit of rebound. You should be starting to get, when did you start getting faster? When did you start? And we can see how long it took to see kind of that super compensation, or see kind of the response from integrating, speed complexes or whatever it may have been. And so that's kind of a second piece that we do to that, way more sport specific, right? And then I think, and you're never gonna, doesn't matter where you're training, if you have access to an ice house, if you have access to force plates, or you don't, is that you just ask the athlete, right? How do you feel today? And I still use relative intensities. I think that's really important to program off relative intensities. I think it makes it a much more individualized. It allows the athlete to have more autonomy and kind of accountability and responsibility in their own programming. Is to figure out, did I actually do this session appropriately? Did I get out of it what I was supposed to get out of it? Was it as hard or as easy? Or was it recovery based? Was it really fatiguing based? Was it kind of a moderate day? Like I put that on the athletes, and we have a lot of conversation on the floor. How are you feeling? How did that feel? How did this go? Set by set, day by day. And so I think that's something that everybody can do anywhere, which is the beauty of it. And so conversing with athletes a lot in all of these aspects that we do allows me to really get a better understanding of how is that athlete's general vibes towards training in the first place, but then ultimately, are they doing what they need to do to actually be prepared to go out there and be successful when it's time to compete? And I have these conversations with that. I think that educating the athletes to a certain level becomes really important. I don't think it's put your head down and do what I say. I think that's a really bad method. The relative intensities doesn't follow that anyway, because you're already putting responsibility on them to understand their body, understand what the session gave them, and whether or not that was appropriate. And they're responsible to then have that conversation and adapt. It could be set by set, it could be week by week, it could be session by session. And so I like educating the athlete and giving them kind of that responsibility and autonomy over their own programming. But also, I'm not traveling with them all season. And so they have to have a base understanding of what we're doing and how we're doing it. What's the goal of this session, and how can I best execute when I'm not around all the time? And so I'm always kind of talking through is like, okay, this is generally how you should be feeling from last week or from yesterday, or in this general phase, expect to be really tired, or in this general phase, expect to be starting to feel a little bit more poppy, starting to feel a little bit more powerful. That's my goal. And I give them kind of that base knowledge as we start, because then if they're not, they should be holding me accountable. Oh, you said I should start to feel a little bit more speed or a little bit more poppy, or my time should start going down a little bit or whatever. But I don't think that's happening. Or, I still feel sluggish, and we can have an open conversation on whether or not they're actually responding to training appropriately, and whether or not it's just, things are working. Let's just keep going and keep putting in the work, or we might need to modify, and let's figure out what that means. It doesn't mean stop training. It just means we need to adapt a little bit. Maybe we need to pull this, or maybe we got a lighter today, or maybe we'll take the day off, or maybe you just need to do a little bit more of this than what the rest of the team is doing, right? So those are, three big areas that we definitely are able to execute here in Lake Placid. Some is more like chronic, like adaptation. How are we looking every 2 months or so? Some of it is definitely more like session by session if they're actually in the ice house, and others is daily. Just having that daily conversation and continuing to create a really good rapport, trust with the athletes, and rapport with the athletes, and educating them just a little bit, not to where they can do my job, but they don't need to be able to do that. If they want to, that's fine. If they want to do that, we can go a little bit deeper, but we're not like teaching them how to write the program. We're teaching them what to expect from the program, and I think it's important for them to know that.
No, that's super insightful, and I think what I picked up as you were talking about that is, that near 13 years of experience coming out, and one thing I'd love to kind of pick your brain on and hear more about. For myself, I've coached powerlifting and Olympic weightlifting for almost 10 years. And I think you kind of look back on that time and you can think about, patterns of what's worked, patterns of what hasn't worked, and kind of like big takeaways. From your 13 years in strength and conditioning with Olympic sports, what are some of those big kind of patterns that stick out of like, oh, I wouldn't have realized that until now?
Express the passion that defines you. At Virus, we understand that when it comes to performance, the slightest edge can mean the difference between winning and losing. Each product is designed and tested with performance in mind. This principle inspired the technology that is infused into our apparel. Built with the intention to move with you and work for you, we create tools meant to help express the passion that defines you. The future of technology-driven apparel. Improve performance, prevent fatigue, recover faster, and go further. Virus is a proud sponsor of Josh Gibson and the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. Use code PHILWL for 10% off at checkout. That's PHILWL, PHILWL, for 10% off.
Yeah, that's a good question. That is a really good question. I think as you get more experience as a coach, you do learn to value input from the athletes a little bit more. I don't get, not to the point of like, oh, what do you think you should do in your program this next block? But to the point of like, if they actually trust you as a coach, that they can be honest with you and actually tell you, yes, I'm very tired today. It felt like this. It didn't feel like this. I think that's important. I think as a younger coach, I didn't value that nearly as much. And I just said, this is what we're supposed to be doing because that's what we learned. That's what we need to execute. The fundamentals are really important, which they are. Those don't drop off. They never do. But really valuing the input in like I said, I'm not a luge athlete. I'm not a luge coach. I'm not a sport coach. I'm a physical performance coach, strength and conditioning. And so them telling me how they feel into their sport and what they think is important and whether or not they think it actually helped them is valuable input. If they say something negative, it doesn't mean it changes the plan, but at least it gives me perspective on what they are feeling or what experience they had um, with that part of their training process. Sometimes it does change what I do, and sometimes I do give them a little bit of freedom. We're talking about the sport relevant or the sport specific movements. The how I progress the fundamental movements. There's really, those are, I tell them it's non-negotiable. Everybody talks, that's non-negotiable. We have 2 or 3 movements in every session that you can say you don't like, or why are we doing this or whatever, and I'm just gonna smile on them. It's like, that's what we're doing, right? And I'll tell them, it's like, this is where we're moving towards, this is why we got to do it, but you're just gonna have to suck it up to an extent, even if you don't like the movement. And professional athletes do that. There's like, yes, okay, it's going to be good for me, let's go. But once we start getting to those second 2 sections, the second and third section of sport relevancy and sport specific, getting their input on that becomes a little bit more valuable than obviously those non-negotiables. And so again, it doesn't necessarily, I don't really feel like doing pull-ups, doesn't mean we're not going to do pull-ups, but I really felt like I had great, paddle speed. My turnover was great when I did this movement, when I used bands doing this, when I was doing this, when I was like, okay, great. And then in my mind, I can say, okay, these athletes really like how they respond to this. Maybe it doesn't belong right now. And they don't need to know if it belongs right now. But it's like, okay, maybe that's something I can filter in here a little bit more because the athletes are really responding well to it. Maybe I can filter it in season here. Maybe I can use it in a different manner because maybe they felt or responded to it a little bit differently than how I utilized it when they experienced it. And okay, maybe I can play around with it in season, or maybe as a potentiation, or maybe as this, or maybe as that. But I can only do that, and I can only play around with and kind of optimizing that plan if I ask and value input from the athletes. And so that's, I think, is really important. And I think throughout my coaching career, I'm learning how to ask and converse and just have and communicate with the athletes to a point where it becomes really productive in figuring out where we're going. And then they feel like they have input. And if their input isn't implemented into the plan, I tell them exactly why. Yeah, I really like that. I think we can do it later. Or that's not actually as important as you say it is because of this, this, and this. And this is actually going to be really good. And that's still going to give you the same thing. And you can have these conversations with the athletes. Some athletes don't care. They do. They just want to show up and work hard. And that's great. But there's a whole spectrum. There's athletes that are just like, just tell me what to do and I'll do it. All the way to the athletes of, they want to know every little bit of why you did it, because maybe eventually they want to be a strength and conditioning coach, or maybe eventually they want to do. So they are genuinely just interested. And it's like, I want to know exactly. And some of them can write their own programs at this point, being 10 years in of working with me for the last 10 years.
Wow.
It's what they want to do, right? They actually want to coach past sport. And so you get this whole spectrum, right? And so the ability to kind of communicate and converse and take input from each athlete is really important. And the type of input that you receive may be different depending on the athlete. So that's a big one, I think. And that's been experience, and that's having confidence in myself to take that input too, right? So as I understand what we need to do, I just want to get more perspective.
Yeah, no, that's super insightful. And hearing your perspective on kind of what you learned over, your experience so far is incredibly helpful. And I know a lot of the people listening to the podcast, maybe weightlifting coaches, maybe powerlifting coaches, maybe people who are in school and in academics currently and figuring out what they want to do. When you're thinking about new coaches to bring in and bring on staff, what are some things that you look for? I know you mentioned kind of like you have personally that quote unquote white belt mentality, which is this fellow might have some piece of knowledge or way of doing things that I can adopt and improve on how I do things.
Yeah.
What are you looking at for people who are coming in to fill roles as a strength and conditioning coach?
Yeah, I'm not. So if I were interviewing a fellow, I wouldn't necessarily interview them and say what can you add to our program, right? I think that's more of a thing. Like once they're on the floor, then you learn about what they want to provide or what they think they can provide, or what you think you can kind of get out of them that maybe they don't realize. And so that's kind of more. I think the biggest thing is, and it's hard to gauge through interviews and stuff like this, but we're trying to figure out people that are good communicators,
Mm.
because we do have a wide one. We're working with adults. I think that's really important. And the professional level, we're working with adults. Adults can choose to listen or not listen to you. And if they don't value what you're saying, and they don't think that, and they don't trust and think that there's any credibility in what you're saying, they're just going to say, I don't like that guy, and move on. Right. And so we want someone that can communicate, right? Can you actually communicate who you are, what's your background, and how you do things as a coach, right? We don't need them to have it all figured out, for sure. I mean, they're young, right? We're talking, mid 20s, low 20s. They don't need to have it figured out, and we don't expect them to have it figured out. We want to help them figure that out. But that's part of it. Another thing, and this is really big, and sometimes you really don't know this until they start working. But my most successful interns and fellows have this like natural initiative,
Mm.
and that they want to work because they want to be a part of it and they want to get better. And so something as simple as taking the initiative to make sure the benches are wiped down,
Mm.
putting the bars away correctly, putting the clips in the spot that I want the clips, not just randomly, like actually putting things back and making it look like it's supposed to look, having that initiative and not waiting for other people to do it. That's an example of that. That's not like making you a better coach or helping you program, but it's all part of what this whole world is about, right? You have to put in the work. Strength conditioning is very blue collar, right? It's like you have to be willing to do anything at any point. If that means like on this Monday afternoon, because we want to do a little bit more gymnastics based training with some of our athletes, we're literally putting together like high level super trampoline.
Mm.
I don't know how to do that, but we're going to show up, and the people are going to show us how to do it so that we can continue to do that in the future. But like something like that is just an example of like everybody's all hands on deck, right? And that's how it works in the strength conditioning world. That's how it works in the coaching world in general. That's how it works in the sport world in general, and that's how it works in the working world in general. That's just how it works. And I think those that have more initiative and natural initiative within them seem to learn more. They provide more into our system. They give more to the athletes. The athletes appreciate it. They see it, and they generally are better coaches.
Mm.
And so I think and I don't know if it's just a natural thing that people have in them, or if you can learn initiative or what. But I think that seems to be over the years the more successful individuals, not necessarily the most educated, the most experienced, the better technicians,
Mm.
just overall the one that helped us most achieve success in providing service to athletes had initiative. They're just willing to do what they needed to do. And they didn't ask questions, and they did it on their own, and they didn't have to be told to do it. And so that's a big one. And again, like I said, I don't know if that's something you can teach or not, but that's a big one.
Yeah, I mean, that's super insightful. And I think everyone listening to the podcast has learned a ton, and hopefully they can take it into their professional work or into professional work they end up doing if they decide to be a strength conditioning coach or weightlifting coach or powerlifting coach. If people are interested in either reaching out to you if they have
Yeah.
questions or keeping in contact with you or just kind of following whatever you do, online. Do you have any like social media platforms or anything we can kind of connect them with?
No, I don't actually. I'm not out there. I don't even have an Instagram account. Um, I was I started college. I went to college. My undergraduate year was 2005. I think Facebook came out in 2004. So I was like one of the initial classes of Facebook. But that's all I have as far as social media goes, and I rarely post anything. So as far as someone like following me, you'd almost have to follow my athletes and see if I'm in the video, or my wife posts a lot on Instagram, and maybe I'm in there or something like that. But like, it's never been my thing. And so unfortunately for everybody out there, you can't really watch what I do. Now I'm not trying to hide necessarily, but I'm just not, that's never been my thing. So I don't really have a social media presence. I'm very happy to have people reach out to me or send me an email or whatever it may be on that end, more traditional method. But yeah, I don't know if that's something like, I know that's how the world is. I know social media and like podcasts now, right? We're doing podcasts. We're not just like writing research articles and doing that stuff, which is great. And I love talking to people in person, but I'm not like seeking it out. You know, if you're not in front of me, you're probably not going to hear from me, but you're going to hear a lot from me if you are in front of me. And so that's just kind of how I work. But yeah, I mean, as far as like sharing my email or something like that is perfectly fine. But unfortunately, I don't have a lot of social media.
Yeah, well, if people reach out to me, I'll forward them to you, and I'll say,
Yeah.
That's one thing I love about the podcast is I can get people like Meg Stone and Christian Carter and all these professionals who do great work and have a lot of insights, but you're not going to be able to find them online, and I think that's what's awesome about podcasts is you get an hour kind of hearing about Ambrose, your expertise working with Olympic sport athletes. I think that's fantastic. So if people are interested, they have questions, I'll definitely funnel them to you. For everyone listening, thanks for checking out the podcast. If you enjoyed it, leave a review, let us know, reach out to us, reach out to myself and give me some feedback. Ambrose, great time. Playful chat.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on, Josh, and hopefully we'll cross paths again sooner than later.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'll have to make a trip up to Lake Placid.
Of course.
And for everyone listening, thanks for checking out the podcast. We'll catch you all on the next episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast.